They were built before cranes, before steel, before anything we call modern engineering, and yet they still stand, perfectly fitted, impossibly precise, silently daring us to explain them. If you find this story fascinating, please like, subscribe, and share it with anyone who loves ancient mysteries. Drop a comment below and tell us which of these ancient walls amazes you the most. We read every single one. Somewhere between what history teaches us and what the stones themselves seem to whisper, there is a gap. A strange, uncomfortable gap filled with questions that have no clean answers. All around the world, on every continent, in every climate, ancient builders left behind walls. Not ordinary walls. Not walls made of bricks and mortar that crumble after a few centuries. These are walls made of stones so massive, so precisely cut, and so perfectly interlocked that even today's most powerful construction equipment would struggle to replicate them. These are walls that should not exist, not according to what we think we know about the people who built them. This is the story of 10 such places. 10 sites scattered across the globe, separated by thousands of miles of ocean and land. Built by cultures that had no known contact with one another, and yet sharing construction techniques so similar, so eerily alike, that the question almost asks itself, did these ancient people know something we have forgotten? Begin in southern Africa, in the landlocked country of Zimbabwe, where the land rises gently into open grassland and granite kopjes dot the horizon like sleeping giants. Here, roughly 1,000 years ago, the people of the Kingdom of Zimbabwe built something extraordinary. It is called the Great Zimbabwe Enclosure, and it is the largest ancient stone structure in sub-Saharan Africa. The outer wall alone stretches nearly 250 meters in circumference, rises over 11 meters at its highest point, and is almost 5 meters thick at its base. That is not a wall. That is a fortress of stone that seems designed to outlast time itself. What makes the Great Zimbabwe truly astonishing is not just its size, but its construction method. The builders used no mortar, not a drop. Every single stone in that massive wall was cut, shaped, and placed without any binding agent. The walls hold together purely through the weight and friction of the stones pressing against one another. The stones themselves are granite, sourced from the surrounding hills, and were split along natural fracture lines with a precision that speaks of deep knowledge and patient craft. The outer wall features a decorative chevron pattern near its top, a deliberate artistic statement that tells us these builders were not simply practical engineers, but proud craftspeople who wanted their work to be beautiful as well as enduring. For centuries after the decline of the Kingdom of Zimbabwe, European explorers who encountered the site refused to believe that African builders had created it. They invented other explanations: the Queen of Sheba, Phoenician traders, mysterious foreign visitors. It took generations of archaeology to restore the truth. The Shona people built Great Zimbabwe, and they built it magnificently. But the deeper mystery remains. How did they achieve such precision without metal tools, without mortar, without written architectural plans? The stones answer back only with silence. Cross now from southern Africa to the northeastern corner of the Mediterranean, to a sun-drenched hillside in Greece where the Bronze Age left its most dramatic fingerprints. Mycenae, the very name sounds like thunder rolling through old myth. This was the city of Agamemnon, the king who led the Greeks to Troy, if you believe the poets. Whether the myths are real or not, the walls of Mycenae are as real as anything on Earth. And they present a puzzle that has occupied archaeologists for well over a century. The walls of Mycenae are what scholars call Cyclopean, a term that tells you everything about how later Greeks felt when they looked at them. They believed only the Cyclops, the one-eyed giants of mythology, could have lifted stones of such size into place. The blocks used in these walls weigh anywhere from several tons to over 100 tons each. Some are roughly squared, some more irregular, but they are fitted together with a care and density that has kept them standing for more than 3,000 years. The famous Lion Gate, the entrance to the citadel, is crowned by a single lintel stone estimated to weigh 20 tons. with two carved lions standing guard above it, a statement of power so clear it needed no translation then and needs none now. The Bronze Age Mycenaeans were sophisticated people. They kept records in a script called Linear B. They traded across the Mediterranean. They built palace complexes with frescoed walls and drainage systems. And yet, even their own descendants, the classical Greeks of the 5th century BC, looked at the Cyclopean walls of Mycenae and Tiryns and declared them impossible for human hands to have made. That reaction, that instinctive sense of impossibility felt even by people living just 1,000 years after the construction, is itself a kind of data point. Something about these walls exceeds what seems naturally achievable. Fly now east across the Pacific, far past the edge of any map that feels familiar, to a remote archipelago in Micronesia called Pohnpei. Off its coast, half swallowed by mangrove swamps and tidal channels, lies the most mysterious city in the Pacific Ocean. Its name is Non-Madol, and it is built entirely on water, an artificial island city constructed from nearly 1 million tons of basalt stone, placed in the middle of the ocean by a people whose full history remains only partially understood. Non-Madol consists of nearly 100 artificial islets, each one built up from the shallow reef using enormous basalt columns, some of them 6 meters long and weighing several tons each. The construction method is called log cabin style. The basalt columns are stacked in alternating layers, crossing each other at right angles, creating walls that interlock and stabilize themselves without mortar. The overall complex covers around 75 hectares of tidal flat, and at its height served as the ceremonial and political capital of the Sodler dynasty, who ruled Pohnpei for centuries. What baffles researchers most about Non-Madol is the sheer logistics of it. The basalt columns were quarried from a site on the other side of the island, transported by raft or canoe across open water and through reef passages that should have made large-scale transport nearly impossible. Some of the individual stones weigh up to 50 tons. No written records survive from the construction period. Local oral tradition speaks of the founders of Non-Madol using magic to fly the stones through the air to their positions, a story that not literal meaning suggests that even the people descended from the builders found the original construction inexplicable. When UNESCO designated Non-Madol a World Heritage Site in 2016, the official description included the phrase disassociation from living tradition, meaning that the knowledge of how it was built has been completely lost, even among the descendants of those who built it. Turn now to East Asia, to the vast and ancient land of China, where the Qin dynasty, the first unified empire in Chinese history, undertook construction projects so massive they reshaped the physical landscape of an entire continent. The Qin Emperor Shi Huang, who unified China in 221 BC, is most famous in the West for his terracotta army. But the wall-building programs of his era deserve at least equal astonishment. The earliest sections of what would eventually become the Great Wall of China were constructed or connected during his reign, and they stretched across thousands of kilometers of mountains, deserts, and river valleys, using a workforce that numbered in the hundreds of thousands. The early Qin walls were not the elegant stone structures that tourists photograph today. Those later sections were largely rebuilt during the Ming Dynasty over 1,000 years later. The original Qin row walls were built primarily from tamped earth, stone, and whatever local materials were available along the construction route. But their scale was staggering. Workers were conscripted from across the empire, marched to remote frontier regions, and set to work in conditions so brutal that the wall is sometimes called the longest cemetery in the world, because so many laborers died during its construction and were buried within or beneath the structure itself. The Qin walls represent not just an engineering achievement, but a demonstration of political will so extreme it still produces a kind of awe, mixed with horror, an entire civilization bent toward a single colossal purpose. What makes the Qin walls relevant to our larger mystery is not their material sophistication. They were, in construction technique, more straightforward than many of the other sites in this story, but their sheer ambition. They tell us that ancient states were capable of organizing labor and resources on a scale we might instinctively underestimate. If the Qin could build thousands of kilometers of wall using conscript labor and relatively simple techniques, what might other ancient cultures have achieved with different methods but equal determination? From the mountains of East Asia, travel west across the entire breadth of the Eurasian continent to the Iberian Peninsula, to the Spanish city of Tarragona on the Mediterranean coast of Catalonia. Here, in a city better known today for its Roman amphitheater and its reputation as a weekend destination for Barcelona visitors, there exists a section of ancient wall that does not fit comfortably into any accepted historical narrative. The megalithic walls of Tarragona predate the Roman city that was built on top of them. They predate, in fact, almost everything that conventional history assigns to this part of Spain. The lower courses of the walls of Tarragona are built from massive polygonal blocks, some of them several meters across, fitted together without mortar in an irregular but perfectly stable pattern. The Romans, when they arrived and made this city their provincial capital, simply built on top of these existing walls, incorporating them into their own construction because the megalithic foundation was already stronger and more enduring than anything they would have needed to build from scratch. Who built those lower courses? When? Using what tools and what methods? Mainstream archaeology attributes them to the Iberians, the pre-Roman inhabitants of the peninsula. But the specific techniques used, the scale of the stones, the precision of the fitting sit uncomfortably alongside what is otherwise known about Iberian construction capabilities. The walls of Tarragona belong to a tradition of polygonal masonry found across the Mediterranean world, a tradition that seems to emerge, flourish, and then disappear from the historical record without a fully satisfying explanation of its origins. And nowhere is this tradition more magnificently displayed than at the most famous oracle site in the ancient world, Delphi. Delphi sits on the slopes of Mount Parnassus in central Greece, in a landscape so dramatically beautiful that the Greeks were completely convinced it was the center of the world. They called it the Omphalos, the navel. The sanctuary of Apollo at Delphi was the most important religious site in the Greek world for nearly 1,000 years, consulted by kings, generals, and city-states before any major decision. Pilgrims traveled from across the Mediterranean to hear the prophecies of the Pythia, the oracle who spoke on Apollo's behalf while seated above a chasm in the rock. But long before the classical Greeks built their temples and treasuries at Delphi, someone else had already shaped the landscape there with stone. The retaining walls and terracing structures that underpin the sanctuary complex include sections of polygonal masonry so precisely fitted that they have become something of a standard reference point for this style of construction. The blocks are irregular in shape. No two are exactly alike. And yet they fit together so perfectly that the joints between them follow curves and angles with a precision that would praise a modern stonemason working with power tools. There are no gaps, no settling, no crumbling. These walls have survived multiple major earthquakes that destroyed the classical structures built on top of them, which gives you some sense of the difference in engineering quality between the two traditions. How were the Delphi polygonal walls built? The standard explanation involves patient trial and error, cutting a stone roughly to shape, holding it against its neighbor, marking where it needed to be trimmed, removing it, trimming it, replacing it, and repeating until a perfect fit was achieved. This explanation is plausible in theory. In practice, when you stand in front of the actual walls and trace the joints with your eyes, joints that curve and back, angle, and interlock in 3 dimensions, across stones that weigh multiple tons each, the patient trial and error explanation begins to feel a little thin. The effort required would have been almost incomprehensible by the standards of any other construction tradition we know of. Now travel further, much further across the Pacific Ocean to the most isolated inhabited island on Earth. Easter Island, or Rapa Nui as its people call it, sits alone in the South Pacific, more than 3,000 kilometers from the nearest populated land. It is famous, of course, for the moai, the massive stone statues with their distinctive elongated faces and top knots, standing in silent rows along the island's coast. But on the southwestern coast of Easter Island, at a platform called Ahu Vinapu, there is something that has sparked one of the most contentious debates in all of Pacific archaeology. The Ahu, the stone platforms on which the Mayu stand, vary considerably in their construction quality across Easter Island. Most are built from rough, irregular stonework. But Ahu Vinapu is different. Its facing wall is constructed from large, carefully shaped stone blocks fitted together with a smoothness and precision that is immediately striking. The joints are tight, the surfaces are dressed flat, and the overall impression is of a construction technique markedly more sophisticated than the typical Easter Island style. Thor Heyerdahl, the Norwegian explorer who famously sailed a balsa raft from South America to Polynesia in 1947, pointed to Ahu Vinapu as evidence of contact between Easter Island and the pre-Inca cultures of coastal Peru. The similarity between the stonework at Ahu Vinapu and the Inca and pre-Inca walls of the Andes is, to an untrained eye, genuinely striking. Mainstream archaeology has largely rejected Heyerdahl's contact hypothesis. Genetic and linguistic evidence strongly supports a Polynesian origin for the Rapa Nui people, with no confirmed South American ancestry until very late in the island's pre-contact history. But the visual similarity between Ahu Vinapu and certain Andean walls remains unexplained to most people's full satisfaction. Either the similarity is coincidental to separate traditions independently arriving at similar solutions, or the story of pre-Columbian Pacific contact is more complex than the consensus currently acknowledges. Either possibility is remarkable. From the most isolated island on Earth, return now to the Mediterranean, to the mountains of Lazio in central Italy, where a series of ancient hilltop towns preserve some of the most impressive and least discussed megalithic walls in Europe. The town of Norba, or rather, the ruins of ancient Norba. Since the town was destroyed in the 1st century BC during a Roman civil war and never rebuilt, sits on a ridge overlooking Norle Malleus, the Pontine Plain south of Rome. Its walls are among the finest surviving examples of polygonal masonry anywhere in the world. The walls of Norba are built from massive limestone blocks, some of them 3 meters long and weighing many tons, fitted together in the irregular polygonal style with a precision that continues to astonish visitors. What is particularly remarkable about Norba is that the builders clearly understood not just the aesthetic dimension of polygonal masonry, but its structural logic. The irregular shapes of the blocks mean that each stone is uniquely positioned, bearing loads at multiple points and distributing weight in a way that makes the wall more stable than any regular coursed construction could be. This is not accidental craft. It reflects genuine engineering knowledge, an understanding of how irregular forms create structural resilience. Norba was a Latin town, and the conventional attribution gives the walls to the Latin peoples of the early 1st millennium BC. But, as with so many of the sites in this story, the gap between what we know about the builders' general technological level and the specific achievement represented by the walls is wide enough to raise questions. The stone cutting required to produce blocks of this size, fitted to this precision, using iron tools at best, in the absence of any powered machinery, represents an investment of skilled labor that seems almost disproportionate to the requirements of a town wall. Unless the builders knew something about this particular technique that made it, in ways we do not fully understand, the most efficient method available to them. Nearby, scattered across the Apennine region of central Italy, the ancient Umbrians left behind similar evidence of megalithic ambition. The Umbrian people, one of the oldest groups in the Italian peninsula, built their hilltop towns with stone walls that in some cases rival the most impressive construction anywhere in the ancient Mediterranean world. The walls of towns like Aemilia, whose foundations are attributed to pre-Roman occupation, feature courses of stone blocks so large, some individual blocks, reportedly weighing over 50 tons, that they test the imagination when you consider the absence of mechanical lifting equipment. What distinguishes the Umbrian walls from many other megalithic traditions is the degree of regularity in some sections, rather than the purely irregular polygonal style. Some Umbrian walls show large rectangular or subrectangular blocks carefully stacked in rough courses, suggesting a slightly different approach to the same fundamental challenge. How do you build something that will still be standing 1,000 years from now? The answer: repeated independently across dozens of cultures on multiple continents. Seems always to involve making the individual stones so large that they cannot be easily moved, damaged, or displaced. Not by enemies, not by earthquakes, not by the slow grinding weight of centuries. And now we arrive at the final and perhaps most extraordinary destination in this story. High in the Andes Mountains of Peru, at an altitude of over 3,500 meters above sea level, on a hillside above the city of Cusco, the sacred capital of the Inca Empire, stands a fortress whose walls have stopped engineers, architects, archaeologists, and ordinary visitors in their tracks for 500 years. Its name is Sacsayhuaman, and it may represent the single greatest achievement in the history of stone construction. The walls of Sacsayhuaman are built in a zigzag pattern. 3 massive terrace tiers of stone climbing the hillside in a series of sharp angles. The individual stones are enormous. The largest known block weighs an estimated 360 tons, making it one of the heaviest stones ever incorporated into a human structure anywhere on Earth. But weight alone does not capture what makes Sacsayhuaman extraordinary. What truly sets it apart is the fitting. Every stone in Sacsayhuaman is a unique polygonal shape, and every stone fits against its neighbors with a perfection that defies description. The joints are so tight that a piece of paper, or in the famous test, a credit card, cannot be inserted between them. This is not just craftsmanship. This is something else. The stones were quarried at sites several kilometers away, transported across mountain terrain without wheeled vehicles or draft animals capable of pulling such loads, shaped to their final form, and then fitted together with a precision that modern stonemasons who have studied the site describe as practically impossible to replicate. Spanish conquistadors who arrived in the 16th century and saw Sacsayhuaman for the first time were so overwhelmed that some of them wrote in their accounts that it must have been built by demons. The Inca themselves attributed its construction to a previous race of giants. The conventional archaeological explanation involves large numbers of workers, wooden levers and ramps, patient trial fitting, and a highly organized state capable of mobilizing massive labor. Forces an explanation consistent with everything we know about the Inca state. But it leaves many engineers uncomfortable, because the three-dimensional polygonal fitting of Sacsayhuaman goes considerably beyond anything else the Inca are known to have built, suggesting either a pinnacle of achievement or an inheritance from an earlier tradition. It is this last possibility, the inheritance hypothesis, that ties all 10 of these sites together into something more than a list of impressive ruins. When you map them, Great Zimbabwe, Mycenae, Non-Model, the Chin Walls, Tarragona, Delphi, Ahu, Vainapu, Norba, Umbria, Sacsayhuaman, you have sites in Africa, Europe, the Pacific, Asia, and South America. The cultures responsible for them had no known contact with one another. They spoke different languages, worshipped different gods, ate different foods, and lived in vastly different environments. And yet they all, independently, apparently arrived at the same fundamental insight, that the way to build something permanent is to cut large, irregular stones and fit them together within human precision without mortar, so that the weight and geometry of the stones themselves provides the stability. Coincidence? Possibly. Independent invention of similar techniques. Also possible, after all, if you are trying to build a stable wall from stone without mortar. The polygonal interlocking approach is arguably the logical conclusion of any serious engineering inquiry. But the degree of similarity, not just in the basic approach but in specific details of execution, has kept a persistent minority of researchers pointing toward a different explanation. that there was once a shared tradition of stone construction, perhaps associated with a period of human civilization older than our current historical models acknowledge, and that the megalithic sites around the world are its scattered inheritance. This is not a fringe idea invented by conspiracy theorists. It is a genuine scholarly debate conducted by archaeologists, geologists, and ancient historians who look at the same evidence and reach different conclusions depending on which anomalies they weight most heavily. The mainstream view holds that each of these sites is explicable within the cultural context of its known builders, even if the full details of construction methods remain uncertain. The alternative view holds that the similarities are too specific and too widespread to be explained by independent invention, and that our timeline of human civilization needs to be revised. What is beyond debate is this: the stones are real. The precision is real. The scale is real. Whatever explanation you prefer, conventional or unconventional, the builders of these walls achieved something that commands our deepest respect and our most serious inquiry. They built for eternity, and eternity so far has honored the bargain. The walls of Great Zimbabwe have stood for 1,000 years. The Cyclopean walls of Mycenae have stood for 3,000. The polygonal walls of Delphi have survived earthquakes that flattened everything around them. Sacsayhuaman has endured 5 centuries of earthquakes, Spanish colonialism, deliberate demolition for building materials, and the relentless attention of 1 million tourists every year. Somewhere in the silence between these stones, in the hair-thin joints of Sacsayhuaman, in the chevron patterns of Great Zimbabwe, in the basalt columns of Nanmadol rising from the Pacific tidal flats, there is a message. We have not yet fully decoded it. We may not have the tools, intellectual or physical, to do so. But the walls themselves are patient teachers. They have been waiting thousands of years for us to pay close enough attention. They are still waiting. The greatest mysteries are not always found in hidden tombs or encrypted texts. Sometimes they stand in plain sight, on windy hilltops and jungle clearings and Pacific atolls, built from nothing but stone and knowledge and a will to endure that we can admire but barely comprehend. These walls were not built for us, but perhaps, in some strange way, they were built to outlast everything else until we were ready to ask the right questions. We are only beginning to ask them. If this story moved you, intrigued you, or made you look at the ancient world differently, please like this content, subscribe for more, and share it with someone who loves history and mystery. Your support makes it possible to keep exploring the unexplained corners of our world. Disclaimer: this content is created for educational and informational purposes only. While all referenced sites are real and the described features are based on documented archaeological research, some interpretations of construction methods, historical context, and cultural connections reflect ongoing scholarly debate and may represent one of several competing academic viewpoints. Ancient mysteries, by their nature, invite multiple interpretations, and this story presents some of those perspectives in narrative form.